Good afternoon. I hope this finds all of you well, and social distancing and doing all the things that are necessary to keep you well and the people around you keep them well. Today I started wearing a mask out in public, even though they say that as long as you're social distancing, you don't really need the mask. I thought, well, I'd go ahead and do that anyway, just in case, not so much to protect myself, but just in case I was carrying it. And there have been so many deaths now. I think it's 23,000, or maybe I have that number wrong. Maybe it's 2,000, but one death is too many. So, okay, today I'll be sharing with you some remarks about Jesus, the canonical Jesus, as a miracle worker. For those of you who have New Testament with me, a few of these points will be similar, or familiar at least, but I'm going into more depth certainly in how we're covering it in here. I'm sure that this lecture will take several mini lectures. So get yourself comfortable, get something to take notes with in front of you, and of course have your New Testament and your Gospel parallels up close at hand. The subject of Jesus as miracle worker is a fascinating one. There are just so many different angles from which the subject can be approached. Theologically, the big question is what do the miracles have to do with Jesus, his identity, his nature, his God, his divine nature, and such things. There's also interesting ways of studying miracle working, in the ancient Near East or in the Mediterranean at the time of Jesus, and comparing and contrasting there. There's also, of course, a more literary, textually based study of the miracles in the New Testament, and that's what we're going to be. That's the approach that we're going to be taking. Although from time to time I will be drawing on some of those other approaches to illuminate our discussion. The first point I've got up here on my manufactured elegant board notes is the question about what are the different theories about the purpose or the function of the miracle stories. David Tiede wrote a very interesting book called The Theos in Air, and I've forgotten the rest of the title. But in Greek, Theos in Air means a divine man. And Tiede's argument was that there was, at the time of Jesus and Paul, an understanding in the Hellenistic Roman world of a special kind of person who could perform miracles, who looked to be very human but was actually divine. It was a very popular book, got a lot of attention. One of my best friends did a very good job of disabling a lot of Tiede's arguments, but I mention him because he raised up this notion that there was a kind of a form of a person, a type of person in the Mediterranean during this time that was known as a Theos in Air, a divine man. Another theory about the purpose, let me just say here, right, if Tiede is correct, certainly one of the functions of the miracle stories would have been to demonstrate Jesus's divinity. Okay, and for a long time I thought, well, yes, but there are other miracle workers at the time of Jesus or shortly thereafter who weren't understood to be divine, but the most popular example, I guess I should put his name up here after Tiede's, but I may have mentioned him to you before, Apollonius. That looks wrong. I think it's 1P. There we go. Of Tyana, who lived just shortly after Jesus, late first century, and he was a philosopher, traveling philosopher. Also had the reputation of being a miracle worker, and he was actually worshipped as divine by one of the sons of one of the Roman emperors. So there might be something to actually connecting miracles with divinity, although we don't want to push that too far because I think the rest of the evidence doesn't support it as strongly. Okay, so in other words, one of the main possibilities about the purpose of the functions of the miracle stories was to prove Jesus' divinity. In Mark's gospel, one of the main purposes of Jesus' miracles is to demonstrate his authority. Now, the Greek word for this I've put up there, I transliterated. It is dunamis. That same word from which dynamite comes, and also dynamic. It's authority, power, to demonstrate these things. And we know from our study of Mark's gospel that Jesus' authority in word and deed is a real important theme throughout much of the gospel. Another possibility is that the miracles show the inbreaking of God's kingdom. This is what we call an imminent apocalyptic eschatology, meaning it's imminent, it's about to happen, or actually has already begun to happen. In Luke's gospel, Jesus says at one point that God's reign is among you, meaning it's already begun. But in Luke, it could well be that and Luke did hold an apocalyptic eschatology, just a slightly different one than Mark and Matthew. It could be that Luke, the function of the miracles in Luke's gospel, was to show the inbreaking of God's reign. In the Gospel of John, there are all kinds of theories about the function of the miracles there. We're going to talk about some of that along the way here. But certainly, if they are eschatological at all, if the miracles are indicating anything about the reign of God, then they indicate that it's already begun. In fact, John's gospel has what we call a fully realized eschatology, where he talks about how, Jesus says to people that believe in me now, and you have knowledge of God. This is something that can happen in the present. John was definitely not an apocalyptic eschatologist, but he did have an understanding of God's reign as fully realized in Jesus. So maybe the miracles helped contribute to that too. As you can tell, there are different theories here, and I'm not siding with any particular one. I just wanted to give you an introduction to a few of them. Okay, one of the interesting topics too in discussion of Jesus's miracle worker is the relationship between miracles and faith. And in the New Testament intro, I talk about this briefly, but there's a difference in the synoptic tradition versus the tradition that's seen in John. And if you go with me to Pericope 52, paragraph 52. And where it talks about, gives us here Mark 2, 1 through 12, and the healing of the paralytic. I'm going to jump into the story partway down, verse 3 in Mark 2. And some people came bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. And when they could not bring him to Jesus because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and after having dug through it, they let down the mat on which the paralytic lay. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, "Why does this fellow speak in this way? It's blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And once Jesus perceived in his spirit that they were discussing these questions among themselves, and he said to them, "Why do you raise such questions in your heart? And in your hearts?" And he goes on to talk more about that. I want to focus on verse 5. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." In the Synoptic Gospels, faith is understood as almost like a prerequisite, a precursor to the miracles. And it's not that the faith causes it per se, but it's almost like it's a necessary condition. Now, on the other side of this issue about the relationship between miracles and faith is John. And if we turn to chapter 4, starting at verses 46 and further following there, we see John's attitude represented well in this story. Beginning at verse 46, when Jesus came again to Cana in Galilee, where he had changed the water into wine, Now there was a royal official whose son lay ill in Capernaum. And when he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and begged him to come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. Then Jesus said to him, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." And the official said to him, "Sir, come down before my little boy dies." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your son will live." This is a good representation of John's attitude. The understanding of the miracles is that Jesus does these, but he does them almost reluctantly because it's almost like the people won't believe in him unless they see miracles. And it's not that Jesus doesn't want to heal people, but he's concerned about the fact that people seem to need this before they will actually believe. There's another passage in John. Wish I could lay my hands on it real quickly, where it becomes even clearer, where Jesus says, I really wish they would believe without the miracles. So it's not a contradictory perspective to the one in the Synoptics, but it's certainly a different one. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the descriptions of the circumstances for the miracles. These are some particular types of these are characteristics of the circumstances that we find, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list at all. But one of the things that is very typical that we find in the situation, or the description of the circumstances for the miracle, is that the seriousness of the situation is often highlighted. In order to illustrate this, we're going to take a look at Mark 5, starting at verse 24b, the second part of verse 24. This introduces what we call a double miracle story. There's one miracle that happens in the beginning, and then another miracle. Jesus travels. Actually, while he's traveling to heal the first person, there's a miracle that happens, and then there's the healing of the first person who was mentioned. Anyway, we notice in verse 25, verse 24, so he went with them. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now, verse 25, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. Okay, one of the ways that the seriousness of the situation is highlighted is to talk about the length of the illness. Okay, in this particular miracle too, in verse 26, there's mention, and this is not the only time this kind of thing happens, where that the physicians just could not heal the person at all. Okay. Another typical element in the circumstances for miracles can be found in verse 40, where this is after the miracles. They laughed at him, and actually this is the raising of the daughter. When he said, the child is not dead but sleeping, and they laughed at him, and he put them outside, and he raises her from the dead. Anyway, this is a resuscitation here. Yes, I think this. Well, I don't know if the scholars treat this as a resuscitation or not, I'm having a hiccup in my brain on this. But anyway, the point is that they laugh at Jesus. They doubt his ability to heal. Sometimes it's not unusual at all that the dangerous nature of the disease will be mentioned, and we find this example of this in Mark 9:18, where and this is the story about the this is which healing is this? Okay, this is in Mark 9:18. Somebody from the crowd comes to Jesus in verse 17, says,